how Asian slaves became Indians. I'm going to go into depth about how Chinos became reclassified as Indians or indigenous people. Moreover, while indigenous people were reclassified as African and Negroes, Chino slaves were allowed to obtain an indigenous identity and status. The main source of information used for this discussion will be from the book Asian Slaves in Colonial Mexico, From Chinos to Indians by Tatiana Sayas. What's interesting here is that the subject of Asian slaves in Spanish America is not discussed or widely known. In fact, in Tatiana Sayas' book, she states that her book is the first that traces Chino origins in Asia. My goal in this particular episode is to touch on key points which is not readily known to the public. All right. After parts of Asia were conquered by the Spanish crown, Asian people were put into slavery on their own land and later on shipped to places such as Mexico, Peru, and Chile. In other words, they were shipped to Spanish-controlled colonies in America. Now, this is a quote from the book, Asian Slaves in Colonial Mexico. Quote, "The foundation of the Spanish Philippines gave rise to the trans-Pacific slave trade. Manila became the colonial outpost in Asia where slaves were purchased and the Manila Galeon ships afforded transport to Mexico. Manila was a slave society during the 17th century. Slaves did the majority of the labor, and master-slave relations shaped the general social order. Within years after the Spanish conquest, the bustling port city had some 40,000 residents of diverse origins. A full quarter of this population was enslaved. They were craftspeople, manual laborers, and servants who upheld their master's social structure. By the 1620s, the city had 8,000 indigenous slaves and 2,000 foreign slaves, in addition to an untold number of Muslim slaves. The whole of the city was a slave market, supplying labor to Spanish colonists and indigenous elites. Slave auctions were held in the plazas found within the city walls, and masters also sold slaves through individual transactions. The unorganized nature of the market makes it nearly impossible to quantify the volume of slaves, but it is clear that Manila was an emporium for slaves. Masters from throughout the Philippines knew to come to the capital to secure chattel property. Now, these slaves were from diverse places, and they were called Chino slaves. And they came from places such as Philippines, India, Bengal, Indonesia, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, Japan, China, and other places. Now, once in Mexico, all of these people became Chino slaves. Now, here is a backstory of what took place in the Philippines. And what took place in the Philippines also mirrors what took place in America when both empires, the Philippines and America, fell to the Spanish crown. I'm going to read a page from the book Asian Slaves in Colonial Mexico, and it's from page 46. Okay. It says, quote, "The Spanish government instituted the same forms of labor organization in the Philippines as in the American colonies, first allowing colonists to have encomiendas and then pushing for reform with the repartimiento system. Under encomiendas, a Spaniard was allotted a group of Indians who owed him personal service. Repartimiento was a crown-controlled system that required Indians to work for nominal pay." Okay, so I use that quote just to show how what happened in the Philippines and the Americas, they operated under the same types of system, which was pretty much a caste system where the lighter skin would kind of become the Chino slaves or the Indians, and then at the bottom you would have the reclassified indigenous people being reclassified as Negroes working at the bottom in the sugar plantations and in the fields and the rice plantations. Okay, so that's why I use that quote to show that both the Philippines and Spanish America, now Spanish America, were under the Spanish crown. And the type of system that operated was the same in the Philippines and it was the same in Spanish America, right?
This is a Naga from the northeast of India presenting his headhunting trophy. This is an Igorot from the Cordillera region of the North Philippines presenting his headhunting trophy. And these are people of Taiwan presenting their headhunting trophies. What? These are not just coincidences. A tradition done in three faraway different places with the similar ways, purposes, and practices. Headhunting was done as a form of warfare, trophy, channels of rituals and spirituality, and many more exactly the same reasons adhered to by the Naga people, the Igorots, and the indigenous people of Taiwan. There must be a connection between these three tribes. And if these aren't enough, consider also the Dayaks of Borneo, who are headhunters with the same purposes. I myself is an Negrito, and I believe that this is not just a cultural coincidence. There must be a connection between us, and the question is, how? Proto-language. The biggest proto-language in the world is Indo-European language, where English, German, French, and etc. belong to. The most widespread language in the world is the Austronesian language, where we belong to. This language reached faraway places that are almost impossible to be reached during the old times, thousands and thousands of years ago. Now let's take a look at how Austronesian, the language that we belong to, spread out. This is an illustration that shows the spread of Austronesian language. As mentioned earlier, Austronesian language is the most widespread language of all. You can easily spot that Easter Islands is far away from Madagascar. That is half of the world. And while you are amazed about that, you will be astounded once again that this spread happened not on land but between the seas and the ocean. The spread of the Austronesian language did not move by horses or chariots but by boats and more boats. This exactly tells us that the forefathers of the people in these countries are excellent sailors and navigators. So now you're looking at this map and you realize that we have a connection through language with Hawaii, Madagascar, Easter Islands, New Zealand, and even the former ancient Lapita. Now let's begin where all these journeys started from. If we follow the arrows back to where they started from, it will lead us into a small island that is now called Taiwan. Taiwan was a given name by the Chinese people of the Qing dynasty, but before that, the name of the island was Formosa. Formosa was the first name given by the Portuguese explorers in 1542. That means a beautiful island. Way before the arrival of the Portuguese in 1542 to Formosa, there were already Aboriginal people living there peacefully. There was an extreme amount of diversity within Formosa. There were actually 20 tribes, not including the Sub tribe, that is nowhere seen in the Malayan Peninsula. That makes it again a strong source point of the Austronesian language. Around 4,500 years ago, some group of the Formosan people started migrating south. Formosans were good fishermen and navigators that made them cross the Batanes Channel and reached Luzon despite of how extremely difficult the journey there was. Then the Formosans finally reached the Rio Grande de Cagayan, or the Cagayan River, which is the biggest and longest river in Luzon. Following the Cagayan River, there were groups who followed the smaller Chico River, and the other groups followed the bigger river all the way to Ilagan. The people who followed the bigger river to Ilagan continued through the smaller Magat River, and they became the Southern Cordilleran speakers. During these journeys, some families settled, some families continued to move. Those who were able to settle in Cagayan Valley, became Cagayan Valley languages. Note in mind that in episode 3 of this series, we talked about the Nagas and the Negritos settling in river valleys, riverbanks, hills, and mountains, which totally happened during the migration. When the Formosans arrived in Cagayan Valley, there were already people in there, and these group of people were Negritos. Meaning the Formosans were not the first humans in the Philippines.
Now, at this point in history, the indigenous people were being subdued, and people belonging to the lighter-skinned races helped the colonists subdue the real indigenous people of the land. A clear example of this taking place is in the Philippines. Quote, in the Philippines, both systems allowed for slavery because the native elites were responsible for delivering the laborers to the Spaniards. The lawful enslavement of the indigenous group Negritos exemplifies the leeway given to native chiefs regarding slavery. The colonial government gave permission to the indigenous elites of the larger ethnic group to carry out their own slaving raids. The Pangans, for example, who lived in a fertile province of Pampanga, had license to enslave Negritos. The Kapamangans, you understand what I'm saying, excuse me for the mispronunciation. The Kapamangans were allowed to go to war against their natural enemies, enslave them, and make them work in the rice cultivation. End quote. So later on, Negritos were reclassified as Negroes and lost their indigenous status and became Negro slaves. Now there are other words that that they say that the Negritos, they say they really are Aeta, like Aeta, okay? Because Negrito means little Negroes. And I'm not sure what they were called at that particular time when their nation was being subdued by the lighter-skinned natives. but they were indeed reclassified as Negritos, and they were forced to work on the rice plantation. And as you can see, what happened with the Capamantangans, they worked with the Spanish crown to subdue the true indigenous peoples of the Philippines. Okay. Meanwhile, in America, indigenous people were also being reclassified as Negroes and forced to work on plantations. Now, I'm going to use an example from the article titled The Use of Terms Negro and Black to Include Persons of Native American Ancestry in Anglo North America by Jack D. Forbes. Quote, Negro was also used in a general way in the North American colonies. Some examples illustrate the use of Negro and Black as applied to people of American ancestry. An example is from the West Indies, is especially illuminating. In 1764, William Young was sent to St. Vincent as a part of the British occupation of that island. Living on St. Vincent were about 3,000 black Caribs or free Negroes, about 100 red Caribs or Indians, and some 4,000 French and their slaves, according to Young. The British found it difficult to control the Caribs, and wars were fought with them in 1771 through 1772, and again during 1795 through 1796. During the latter crisis, Young wrote an extremely anti-Carib tract designed to prove that the Caribs should be removed from St. Vincent. They were eventually defeated, and some 5,000 Caribs were shipped to an island near the coast of Honduras. Young was anxious to prove that the so-called Black Caribs were not Aborigines, but were in fact Negro colonists, freed Negroes, or Negro usurpers. This was important to him because he wanted to show they had no bona fide land rights or Aboriginal title. This tendency continues, incidentally, amongst white scholars who even today refuse to accept the Caribs' avowed feelings of Indianness and continues to call them Black. Now, this is what happened and what they still do today. Okay, so at that time, the indigenous people were fighting and were being reclassified as Negro and Black, and there were some lighter skinned native peoples who were helping them. Okay, I'm gonna read a section from the book Asian Slaves in Colonial Mexico, and this is about another way that was completely a reclassification, or what we would call a genocide on indigenous people through reclassification. Okay, so this is from the page 110 in Asian Slaves in Colonial Mexico. All right, so quote, the devastating demographic collapse of the indigenous population in the 16th century transformed the labor system in Mexico. The drop in population was almost inconceivable. Approximately 15 million native people lost their lives between the 1530s and 1608 in central Mexico. So you mean to tell me in less than 100 years, 15 million native people died? They lost their lives or were killed? All right? And this is not to make light of the situation or to poke fun at it, but what I'm saying is that all of these people that they reclassified as Negroes, as African slaves, a lot of those people were indigenous people. But it makes it look like there was a complete slaughter or genocide of indigenous people. When you just reclassify them, then you can say they're all dead. But no, they're not dead. They've just been reclassified. They were reclassified by the pen.
Meaning the Formosans were not the first humans in the Philippines.
Now I'm going to give you an example of how a Chino slave became an Indian. All right, this is again, from the book Asian Slaves in Colonial Mexico. Quote, as in Iberia, the capture and sale of Muslims was permitted under canon and secular law. In 1570 and again in 1620, the king declared that it was legal to enslave Muslims in the Philippines. Two Spaniards testified that Bartolome was indeed a slave because he was a son of Maria Convexo, a Muslim slave who traveled with her master, Governor Tabora, to Mexico, where Bartolome was born. No doubt, Maria Convexo was a legal slave because the just war theory did indeed allow the enslavement of women and children. Maria, however, had to undergo forced conversion, and she also relocated to Mexico, which transformed her into a Chino slave. In this different colonial context, the son of a Chino slave could indeed take on the identity of an Indian. Let me read that again. Maria, however, had to undergo forced conversion, and she also relocated to Mexico, which transformed her into a Chino slave. In this different colonial context, the son of a Chino slave could indeed take on the identity of an Indian. Once in Seville, Bartolome knew to claim he was an indigenous person because that is exactly what other Chino slaves did in Mexico. They became Indians to be free. Okay? Let me give you another example. Quote, Chinos, like Francisco, followed in the path of free natives of the Philippines who immigrated to Mexico. The Filipinos, confusingly called Chinos as well, laid the groundwork for Chino slaves who, like themselves, became indigenous vassals of the Spanish crown after Chino slavery was abolished in 1672. Over time, all of their diverse ethnic identities were folded together into one Indian identity. Filipinos thus became part of an increasingly multi-ethnic population and took part in redefining Indian identity in Mexico. End quote. But this did not work. Redefining yourself did not work for all Chinos, especially the ones who were probably the indigenous people of that particular land, but the ones who looked more so like the Negritos, they were not able to reclassify themselves as Indians, okay? So while the Chinos who kind of had that particular, who were lighter skinned, they were able to transform themselves into being indigenous and be accepted as Indians, but the darker skinned ones were not allotted that privilege. All right, let me go to the quote. All right, quote, as the 17th century wore on, inquisitors increasingly looked to skin color to make the distinction between who was a slave versus who was an Indian. The logic was as follows. An Indian was someone who, quote unquote, looked like an Indian. Chinos looked like Indians, so they were Indians, not slaves. Slaves were people with African features. For instance, in 1665, an elder turned in a runaway Chino slave who had blasphemed. Some testified he was a mulatto slave, and others called him Negro. The wording of these testimonies suggests that in 1665, the word black was being used for slave. The accused did not have to testify or even identify who he was. The judge simply accepted the categorization of the Spanish witnesses and treated him as a slave. The unnamed Chino looked like a slave, so he was under the court's jurisdiction. Individuals who had African features or whom witnesses described as castas, meaning people of mixed heritage, were not identified as Chinos or Indians. Individuals who did not resemble Indians, in other words, remained under the court's purview. So this means that if you had some African features, they'll just throw you in a bunch and call you an African, or they'll just call you black or a Negro and you'll just be a slave, okay? So that's how it worked. It was pretty much a caste system. All right, here's another example where it did not work out, okay? Quote, notably, some owners tried to circumvent the law altogether by intentionally changing the ethnic category of their slaves. Check this out. Let me read this again. Notably, some owners tried to circumvent the law altogether by intentionally changing the ethnic category of their slaves. In July 1672, when Monterroso's liberation campaign was already underway, Juan Lopez Marroquin traveled all the way from Zacatecas in Mexico City to sell a slave named Antonio. To certify the property transfer, Juan provided several documents, including an old power of attorney in which Antonio was categorized as a Chino slave. The bill of sale, however, listed Antonio as a mulatto and noted that he was branded on the chin. Juan must have realized that he was about to lose his property if he kept Antonio in the northern frontier, so he took a long journey. Somewhere along the way, Antonio became a slave who had African ancestry, perhaps because he had darkish skin. Juan also took the added precaution of having Antonio marked as a slave on the most visible place on his body. Having forced this transformation on Antonio, one was able to sell him to a buyer who undoubtedly counted on keeping Antonio imprisoned in his textile mill. Okay, so that's how that worked out for the darker skinned Chinos who had these African features. They were reclassified, their ethnic origin was changed. The lighter skinned native people who helped subdue the Aboriginal people were allowed to maintain their indigenous status, but they were still considered subjects or slaves of the Spanish crown and forced to endure a lighter form of slavery, which was not nearby as harsh as what the Aboriginal people had to experience. So this is the talking about how the Chino slaves became Indians, all right? The Chino slaves who were brought from the Philippines were people who were used to working underneath the Spaniards, and the Spanish believed that they were easier to control than Negroes who were there. Once in Mexico, they worked in the textile fields, and though they were laborers, they were not forced to work out in the fields like the dark-skinned Aboriginals, and they soon became identified as Indians, right? Now I want to read to you a section, if I can find it. If I can't, then I'm going to just leave it alone, all right? I believe I did find, I think I did find it, okay? All right, here we go. Yes, all right, this is from page 109. This is a section from Asian slaves in colonial Mexico. Quote, Chinos were mainly servants because Spanish colonists characterized slaves who came from the Philippines as being more domesticated than black Negroes. The same quality was attributed to Indians, who were considered to be naturally obedient and to have an aptness for service. In addition, Chinos were identified as good servants because most of them had some knowledge of Iberian languages, customs, and practices, which they gained in the Spanish Philippines or Portuguese India. This cultural affinity, moreover, encouraged some masters to treat Chino slaves as they did Indians, which meant having slightly more regard for their natural liberty. Right? In addition to personal service, a large number of Chino slaves were employed in textile mills in Mexico City and its environs. Royal officials were particularly vigilant of this urban industry because it was notoriously exploitative of Indian laborers. Chino slaves benefited from this oversight because they were increasingly identified as Indians themselves. Chino slaves thus labored in occupations that enabled them to become free Indians, a status that was eventually confirmed for all Chinos.
When the Formosans arrived in Cagayan Valley, there were already people in there, and these group of people were Negritos. Meaning the Formosans were not the first humans in the Philippines. The latest DNA study was done this year, 2021, and was released on the 22nd of March. The study was conducted by the Lorena Laboratory at Uppsala University in Sweden, one of the most recognized universities in the world. According to this study, the early Negritos are the ancestors of all non-Negrito people of the Filipino tribe, as well as the ancestors of the Malayans, Indonesians, and the Oceanians. The scientists promote the theory that the Negritos were the first Homo sapiens in the Philippines around 50,000 years ago, meaning the Formosans were not the first humans in the Philippines.